Alright, welcome back. Today we're going to be capping off this very long interlude with Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles books. We've looked at the Mayfair Witches trilogy, we've looked at the first book in her Tales of the New Vampires series, and now we're looking at the final book in that series, Vittorio the Vampire. From my research for this video, it seems like Vittorio the Vampire is one of the least well regarded of the Vampire Chronicles just in general, and also it doesn't seem very liked among Anne Rice's books in general. So naturally, I obviously loved it, and I'm going to tell you why it's a fantastic book. Well, I'm not going to go that far, but I do think it is a pretty underrated book, and I definitely preferred it to Pandora, the first book in this series. Part 1, Summary. Vittorio di Ranieri is a 16-year-old Italian nobleman when his family is murdered before his eyes by a powerful and ancient coven of vampires. Vittorio himself is saved by the intervention of a vampire named Ursula. Vittorio is forced to leave his home, and so he heads for Florence, where he happens upon a strange village. Here, there are no beggars, no elderly, or sick, or dying, yet something seems peculiar about the people in the village. Vittorio finds that the village is connected to the vampire coven who murdered his family. After a confrontation with the vampires, Vittorio finds himself with the ability to see angels. Using his newfound ability, he plots his revenge against the coven. Part 2, Pandora versus Vittorio. Since Pandora and Vittorio are the two and only books in Rice's Tales of the New Vampires miniseries, I'm going to contrast the two books in this part of the video. So the Tales of the New Vampires was billed as a series that is detached from the main series and focuses on either secondary vampires or new vampire characters altogether. Pandora told the story of, well, Pandora, who is a secondary character in the main series who doesn't get much time to breathe, and so this story kind of built up her story and developed it. Vittorio the Vampire is more extreme in that Vittorio is a vampire who does not appear in any of the vampire books before, and I believe he doesn't appear in any of the books after this one either, so it's a completely detached and original story. Rice even makes this explicit at the very beginning of Vittorio the Vampire. When Vittorio is introducing himself, he basically says that this is going to be a completely detached story, not related to Lestat and any of his drama. In my review of Pandora, one of my main complaints of that book was that Rice relies too heavily on the mythology and characters from her main series, and that the actual story of Pandora suffers quite a lot from this because it doesn't tell anything original or unique, and instead just relies on previous things and events. Vittorio the Vampire doesn't have this problem because it's completely detached from the main series, and so it feels, to me at least, like a much more complete story. Another reason why I preferred Vittorio the Vampire is that it seemed like in this book Rice was able to fuse together her story with the history a lot better. I felt like in Pandora it was basically a historical novel or an excuse to tell or to talk about the history of that time period that Rice was doing research in, and there was a bit about vampires kind of going on around it. Whereas with Vittorio, it felt like Rice was exploring the history that she's interested in and clearly loves, but also doing that within the context of a very interesting and engaging story. So I felt like these two things went together a lot better in this book. I also felt like Rice's writing wasn't as lazy as it was in Pandora. I noticed in Pandora that she uses very vague descriptive terms sometimes in order to describe furniture or walls or paintings, whereas with this book she gives a little bit more of the detail that we're quite familiar with when it comes to Anne Rice. Still, Vittorio the Vampire is still a very short book, like Pandora, and it's much more concise than Rice's other works, but in general I think she has more of that flamboyance, has more of that detail, and that's another reason why I prefer this book slightly more to the other one. Part 3, Angels and Demons. So Rice introduced angels into Memnoch the Devil, although it was kind of unclear in that book whether angels were real or whether Lestat was just being deceived the whole time. But we get angels recurring in this book, and I don't wonder if this is Rice maybe confirming in some kind of way the stuff that happened in Memnoch the Devil. I don't believe she's ever said anything about this though in interviews, so I don't know how much we can kind of use this as a confirmation of what happened in that book. But it's interesting to see Rice continuing with those themes in this story. Also, the fact that a vampire has the ability to see angels is something a bit novel for the series, and it's probably the thing that makes Vittorio the most interesting. Unfortunately, I was a bit worried when I kind of got to the point where the angels arrived in the book, because by then quite a lot of the story had already been told, and it didn't seem like the angels were playing all that much of a big role in the story. And it was only really at the very end of the story when I understood the role that the angels were playing. And it turns out that they weren't really playing a role in the plot per se, but rather Rice was using them to kind of talk, as she often does, make philosophical points about religion and God and how she kind of views these things. At the end of the book, Vittorio is able to see this kind of pure light and essence inside a person. Essentially, he can see into people's souls and see them departing their bodies when they die. And this was quite a moving part of the book, and I really enjoyed this ending, because it was Rice showing that these souls exist in everyone. She points out in the story that these souls exist in people regardless of whether they're good or bad, and that they also exist in vampires themselves. And this is quite important for Rice and her mythology, because it's basically her confirming that vampires aren't just damned creatures. They do live a terrible existence, and they're certainly not good. She's not saying that they're good because they have souls, but what she is saying is that they do still have these souls. They don't lack souls just because they do evil things. And this is quite important, I think, just for Rice's mythology in general. It's this idea that just because you do terrible things, you still have a soul. You're still someone, worthy of respect in God's eyes. You're not just kind of this thing that's damned and you're going to go to hell and that's that. I have to say as well, because of the ending and seeing how the angels were playing a role in the story, I actually found that the ending of Vittorio was one of the most satisfying endings to the Vampire Chronicles that I've ever come across. One of the issues that Rice has with her writing quite consistently, I think, is that she'll tell a story that's quite rich in detail, and she'll keep going and going and going, and then she'll get to a point where she wants the story to stop. And so sometimes you get a very forced climax or a very abrupt climax, and the story just stops in a way that's not particularly satisfying. Or you have stories where the story just keeps going on and kind of goes out with a whimper. I'm thinking of The Vampire Armand there. It just kind of goes on and maybe should have stopped a bit earlier than it did. Whereas with Vittorio the Vampire, I feel like the ending came quite naturally and was really impressive. And in fact, for all the endings of the story, I think the only ones that match it are the endings of Interview with a Vampire and The Tale of the Body Thief. I think those two endings are really good. I think if there was one weakness that I would point out when it comes to the angels, is that although I think they did play a nice metaphorical role in the story, and they're what allows Rice to explore the philosophical problems that she always explores in her books, I did wish they were more integrated into the plot itself, because they did feel just kind of there for the most part, and it was, like I said, it was only really at the end when I kind of understood what role they were playing in the story. So I think it would have been better if Rice had have maybe integrated them to the story more, and also explored the mythology of the angels a bit more. Vittorio the Vampire, though, is a short book, so I can appreciate why she didn't want to do that, because usually if Rice is going to go into mythology, then the story is going to be a lot longer than this one. But still, I kind of wish that there'd have been a bit more with the angels, they'd played a more active role in the story, and we could have explored the mythology of them a lot more as well. Part 4. Vittorio, the character, and others. So now on to something that I didn't enjoy all that much in this book, and it's unfortunately the main character, Vittorio, and also the other characters around him. Like with Pandora, I felt like the narrator of this story was just a little bit thin in terms of characterization. He isn't a bad narrator, neither is Pandora, but I just don't get a full sense of who these two characters are. Vittorio to me feels like somewhere between Louis and Armand. He's sort of mopey and miserable, but he's got a bit more fire like Armand does, and he's a bit more amoral like Armand is. But unlike Armand and Louis, who are quite, vibrant personalities, I just didn't really get that with Vittorio. He's just not a character that really stands out on his own, because I just kind of see him in the shadow of these two other characters. And unfortunately, the same is true for the secondary characters. First of all, you have Vittorio's brother and sister who die very early on in the story, and this is meant to be a very tragic moment. It could be a very good, character development moment for Vittorio as well, but we don't really spend enough time with these siblings in order to really feel the kind of impact of their deaths. They're not really fleshed out as real three-dimensional characters. They're kind of portrayed as kind of pitiful victims from the start, and that's not particularly interesting. And so they weren't very good. Then you have Ursula, who is the other big character in the story. She's the vampire love interest, and she starts off pretty well. I was quite interested in where they were going to go with her character, and I felt like the relationship between her and Vittorio was quite interesting. But then it quickly turned from this sort of conflicting, kind of half romance, half antagonist relationship to just them being in love with each other, and Ursula's character just went downhill from there, to the point where at the end of the story, she's basically just like a love puppy for Vittorio, which, given that Rice is generally quite good at writing very fleshed out and three-dimensional characters, it was kind of a shame to see that happening to Ursula's character. I think possibly one of the issues with Vittorio the Vampire, it's the same thing with the Pandora, which is that they're both very short books, and it seems to me that Rice in general tends to do better in more elaborate contexts. You know, my favourite book of hers so far is The Witching Hour, which is 1,000 pages. She really does well at that kind of elaborate, ornate style, with lots of world building, lots of mythology, lots of backstory, and those things are where the character development really lies. And so when you abstract away from that, it seems like Rice doesn't do as well. Although there is the exception of Into the Vampire, which is quite short, but manages to do it. So I don't know what it is. Maybe it was just that Rice was getting more used to writing longer works by this point, and so going back to something shorter was trickier. But yeah, it just didn't feel like any of the characters were particularly fleshed out. One thing that I would say, though, is that the angels I actually quite enjoyed. They kind of popped as characters. They were a little bit kind of stock characters, maybe again not the most in-depth characters, but they did stand out, and I like that Rice presented them in a very human way. You know, when we think of angels, we kind of think of these sort of austere beings who talk in a strange way and kind of very detached. But Rice sort of gave them a bit of character, a bit of humanity, which I think is nice to see, that kind of representation of an angel rather than the kind of traditional sense. So I did enjoy the angel characters. But overall, I would say that characterization was one of the biggest weaknesses of the book. Part 5, Conclusion. Overall, I do think that Vittorio the Vampire is a little bit underrated as the Vampire Chronicles books go. Unlike Pandora, it tells a cohesive story that's completely detached from the main series, and it doesn't suffer for that. In fact, I would say it's better for that reason. It's a lot more fresh, it's a lot more engaging. Rice has perfected, well not perfected, but she's improved on her concise style. The characterization is a little bit better, if still quite patchy, and her description is really good, and she's able to tell a very convincing plot that's quite engaging throughout the story. I certainly wouldn't say that this is like an essential book in the series, and when I do my rankings, it's probably going to come quite low down on the rankings. But, you know, I rated it as a solid 3 stars on Goodreads because I think it is a book that I like, I enjoyed it, and it's worth reading, and, you know, I wouldn't listen too much to the negative critiques. I don't think it's a terrible book by any stretch. The only real weak point for me were the characters, and the use of angels was inspired, interesting, but could have been done a little bit better as well. Alright, that's it for this video. I'm certainly looking forward to going back to the main series in the Vampire Chronicles now. I think it's Merrick is the next book because I already read The Vampire Are Man, so that's where we're going to be going next. Let me know what you think of Vittorio the Vampire though in the comments. Do you enjoy this book? Do you think it matches up? How do you think it matches up with Pandora, the other book in this mini-series? I look forward to talking with you about that in the comments. But that's it for this video. Take care everyone. Ta-ra.